welcome to another episode of the Peru Channel Podcast. It's August 6th, 2023, and I'm your host, Philip. In this podcast, I try to share things that I've learned from the perspective of someone who's spent more than 18 years visiting and living in Peru. I get really frustrated with all the experts on social media who try to tell you exactly what Peru is like when they've only been here for a few days. So I started this podcast as a way to talk about the realities of visiting and being in Peru. A quick note before I begin this episode. I'm not going to talk about renting a car. A lot of people have said renting a car is a very bad idea in Peru. Besides the horrendous traffic and road conditions, I've heard many horror stories about problems dealing with rental companies, even reputable international ones. Besides being safer and far cheaper, it's just too easy to take public transportation. So let's get going. I still remember my first trip into a remote section of Peru deep in the Andes that was many hours from the nearest airport, most of it by way of a single-track dirt road. We had hopped on what was a decent bus from Cajamarca in northern Peru to the small town of Celandín. There was no station in Celandín when we got off the bus. You simply had to know where to go to find a ride to where you were going. Fortunately, I was with someone who had been there before, but it would have been easy to ask where to find the spot to catch a ride. I'll talk about this several times in this episode, because the trick to finding transportation is simply to ask. You may have to ask several people before you find someone who knows, but eventually you're going to find someone who can point you in the right direction. It may sound a little intimidating, but to be honest, there's usually no other way. In Celandín, we loaded into a colectivo, which is what they call a shared van, and proceeded to head east deeper into the mountains along a fairly well-traveled road. But just after we crossed the Rio Marañón, which is a massive river that eventually joins up with the Rio Ucayali far downstream to form the Amazon River, we turned south on a dusty road that at times wasn't much more than a trail. I still remember vividly having to keep the windows closed so the people in the back weren't drowned in road dust. The colectivo was filled with local people. Most of them were dressed in traditional Andean clothing that, to be honest, generally hadn't been laundered in a while, as evidenced by the strong odor. It was a fairly quiet trip, as most people on the colectivo tried to sleep, though I sat entranced just staring at the windows at a world that I and few other outsiders had ever seen. Every once in a while, one of the chickens stuffed in a cloth bag in the seat behind me would make a little noise, but it was a fairly uneventful trip, except for the stretch when an old campesino, the name for a rural Andean farmer, fell asleep against my shoulder, or the quick stop when we bought mangoes that literally were picked off the tree while we waited. I think it only took about 6 hours or so to get to our destination, as best I can remember, but many others continued on down the road, if you could call it that. I wish I could remember how much it cost, but I doubt it was more than a few dollars. That's how transportation works in most of Peru. It's always surprising that a country as large as Peru, more than double the size of every European country and almost twice as big as Texas in the United States, has such a limited road system. The northwest region of Loreto, for example, is bigger than Germany all by itself. Despite a population of 33 million people, there are only 18 airports with regular commercial passenger service in Peru. It doesn't take much to recognize the reasons for this. Peru is one of the most geographically diverse places in the world. The coastal desert is actually quite narrow and does have excellent highways and airports, but even from the coast, it's easy to see the rise of the Andes Mountains just a short distance from the beaches in most places. The Andes, by the way, is the world's largest mountain range that runs the length of the country and most of South America, containing 37 peaks over 6,000 meters, or just under 20,000 feet in elevation, and that's just in Peru. There are only a dozen commercial airports in the mountains and the jungle regions that make up over 90% of the country. On the other side of the Andes is the virtually impenetrable Amazon rainforest, which extends for thousands of kilometers all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Peru's eastern Amazon is home to Iquitos, the largest city in the world that can't be reached by road. It has about 500,000 inhabitants, but if you want to visit there, you travel there by boat or by air. There's no other options. So how do people get around, especially to those places where the nearest air service may be many hours away? Like anywhere in the world, transportation systems always arise to enable a person to get anywhere they wish to go, no matter how remote. Peru is no exception, with a decentralized system that is often at best a challenge to understand even for a local, but the possibilities are almost limitless. Just about every city and town in Peru is connected by buses. There are probably hundreds of bus companies. That's because the demand to move across the country in every direction in a relatively inexpensive fashion is so high. Because of the dominance of the Andes, there's no such thing as a straight or flat road throughout much of the country's road system. Because of this, travel by road is slow at best except along the coast. Besides the winding mountain roads, the buses must constantly climb and descend over mountain passes. I know it's cool to watch documentaries about mountain roads with steep drop-offs of thousands of feet next to a road with no guardrails and a driver who seemingly has a death wish based on the speeds by which he drives. Transportation drivers in Peru, by the way, are almost always men. The fact is, this is actually part of the reality of travel in the Andes. If you have a fear of heights, don't take a bus or don't look out the window and just pretend there's nothing outside. It's for this reason that I'll only use two bus companies in Peru, Cruz del Sur and Mobile. Both have excellent reputations, excellent safety records, and are quite comfortable even for lengthy trips. Not a week passes that there is not at least one report of a crash or of a bus going off the road and falling into a deep ravine, resulting in many deaths and injuries. Almost always, speed is the biggest contributing factor, but a lack of sleep for the drivers almost certainly plays a big role too. For this reason, I refuse to use any bus company except the two I mentioned unless I'm traveling a short distance. Every big city and town has a terminal terrestre, which means bus station or transport station. Many, like Lima, have more than one, and they can be enormous. For this reason, Cruz del Sur and Mobile, along with some other larger bus companies, have their own stations which may or may not be near the main station. Both Cruz del Sur and Mobile have excellent websites that are easy to navigate even if you don't speak Spanish. I'll put a link to both in the show notes. As I mentioned before, colectivos are basically shared van rides that go where it's easier to move smaller groups of people all over. They generally are quite a bit cheaper and move faster, but they're often more crowded and less comfortable. Often the colectivo drivers seem more maniacal than the bus drivers. In some parts of the country, colectivos are called combis, but it means the same thing. Sometimes the smaller towns have terminal terrestres, which serve as transportation centers that accommodate mostly colectivos as well as buses. While it may look chaotic, all you have to do is ask where to catch a ride to your destination. Just ask, quote, ¿Dónde es el transporte para? And then you fill in the blank with your destination. For example, if you wanted to find where to get a ride from Cusco to Pisac, you could ask the reception desk at your hotel or just someone on your street, ¿Dónde está el transporte para Pisac? And anyone can point you in the right direction. When you get on transportation, always be sure to confirm where you're going and the cost before getting in. I've had drivers try to charge me a little more upon arrival, and this can be extremely frustrating even if it involves a relatively tiny bit of extra money. Fortunately, this has been very rare. Another very, very common mode of transportation is simply hopping in a car, here referred to only as an auto, from a designated place where they leave for a specific destination. This is common for both short and long distance routes and is always faster. The challenge, as I've mentioned before, with both colectivos and auto transportation is finding where to catch a ride to wherever you're going. In Peru, they are generally for people who regularly travel to those destinations and who know the departure points. Tourists almost never know either. Even locals in larger towns like Cusco probably don't most of the main departure points. Some, like going to Pisac or Ollantaytambo or even Puno, are known by everyone, but I'll bet very few Cusqueños know where to catch a ride to smaller places like Paruro or Corca. There's nothing wrong in asking where to find transportation. People do it all the time. In fact, every day I see people who live in Cusco ask the local buses, which are everywhere, if a certain bus goes to a certain place. Many of the departure points I've learned in Cusco, for example, I've learned simply by spotting a sign while walking or driving through town. A remote, distant place may only have a couple of cars traveling out of a little alley, while others like Chinchero may be tucked away in places that are a little hard to find for an outsider, but are very busy with vehicles leaving all day long and deep into the night. As I mentioned over, and I'll keep mentioning, the trick, if you want to go somewhere that is significantly off the beaten path, is just to ask. For me, there's nothing as exciting as traveling on the Amazon River, especially on a boat filled with local people. Yes, traveling on the water is a big part of life in much of Peru, especially in the country's largest region, Loreto, where Iquitos is located, where river travel is virtually all there is for hundreds of miles in every direction. I'm not going to talk about travel on the rivers around Pucallpa and Puerto Maldonado, as they both have significant road access, so river travel is not a part of everyday life as it is in Iquitos. 99% of tourists reach Iquitos by plane, and I'll bet that almost none know that the city has many ports along the city waterfront that take passengers in every possible direction along the Amazon River or one of its significant tributaries. One route that a handful of hardy tourists like to take is to travel to Iquitos from Tarapoto, which is the last airport in the northeast before the rainforest. They do that by flying into Tarapoto, then going by road, using a small bus or colectivo, to the small river town called Yurimaguas. From there, it's possible to catch a slow boat moving down the Rio Marañón to Iquitos in about 3 to 4 days. I've never done it, as it's a long trip on a hot, slow boat filled with cargo and livestock on the lower decks, while you sleep in either a closed-off cabin or, with the majority of local passengers, on the top deck covered in hammocks. For people easily bored, this is probably not a good recommendation because of how long it takes, but it certainly would be an adventure that few outsiders have ever done. From what others have told me, it's often necessary to buy your ticket in advance, as they don't leave until they're full of cargo, which could take an extra day or two. The pre-announced departure time seems to be hopeful at best, so everyone recommends staying on board so you don't miss a departure, which could come up at any time, day or night. Everyone also says you have to buy your ticket from the captain himself, as sometimes there are people who will take your money but who have no authority to sell tickets or space on the boat. While cabins are available and can be locked, many people have told me that it's best to purchase a cabin and use that cabin to secure your things while paying for hammock space to sleep, where the jungle heat is not nearly so bad and you can spend the time socializing with local people. In recent years, fast boats have started making the run from Yurimaguas to Iquitos, but I haven't talked to anyone yet who made the trip in one. I don't know that it would be the same thing. Even though you could get there faster and cheaper, it just wouldn't have the same adventure spirit that it would going on a slow boat. The same basic boats also travel in other directions up and down the Ucayali River to the city of Pucallpa from Iquitos, and even to the east towards the tri-border with Brazil and Colombia. People have a lot of good things to say about the newer fast boats to Brazil from Iquitos, which are comfortable and are even air-conditioned. In Iquitos, most people who want to go up or down the Amazon or its nearest large tributary, the Rio Nanay, know that boats serve as the region's bus system. At any time during the day, you can stand on the eastern edge of Iquitos and see at least a dozen or more boats moving in and out of the city in every direction. And that doesn't even include boats arriving and departing from various ports between the Nanay and the center of town along the Rio Ataya. By the way, most people don't realize that the Amazon River actually hasn't flowed in front of Iquitos' famous waterfront since 1998, 4 years after it cut a new channel farther downriver. When the water levels are high today, the Italia flows through the old Amazon course and spreads out over a kilometer, looking like a massive river, but in fact it's quite shallow and relatively small. Traveling on the Amazon is an experience that everyone who goes to Iquitos should do. Most people who visit a jungle lodge will spend some time on the river, but it's just not the same as traveling in a slow boat with local people. There's lots of ways to take a short trip if you want to get the experience. For example, from the port of Bellavista Nanay, for 3 soles you can go to the small town of Padre Cocha, about 30 minutes up the Rio Nanay. In Padre Cocha, you can also visit Pilpintuasi, known locally as the Mariposaria or Butterfly Farm, that's run as an animal sanctuary by my friend Gudrun for about 20 years now. It's a real labor of love for her, and she can always use the support of visitors to help keep the place going. When you're finished, you can walk back through town and then hop on a boat at the same place you got off when you arrived at Padre Cocha. A fun overnight trip is to take either a fast boat called the Rapido or a long slow boat to the small town of Tamchiacu, about 1 to 2 hours upriver on the Amazon. There's a couple of places to stay there. One of them even has a few air-conditioned rooms, which is not at all common outside of Iquitos. In fact, I don't know another place anywhere that has them, even though there probably are some smaller hotels. Those boats going to Tamchiacu are found at Puerto Lao, which is close to the center of Iquitos. As always, any taxi driver can take you there quickly and cheaply. Tamchiacu is a chance to spend a little time in a real Amazon river town. Tourists are very rare there, and life is simple and quiet along the mighty Amazon River. The first boat leaves from Iquitos around 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and boats return from the riverfront in Tamchiacu all day until around 5 or 5:30 in the evening. I can't recommend these kinds of trips enough as a way to experience a way of life that honestly has gone untouched for a very long time and is probably completely different from any place you've ever been. Well, I hope this episode helps you to understand how things work in Peru a little better. It can be a challenge getting around, but I promise it can also be an adventure that isn't nearly as tough as it seems. The great thing about Peru is that you can literally go anywhere in the entire country, including the most remote places imaginable, using public transportation. I've often thought to myself, is there anywhere I couldn't reach as long as I knew the name of my intended destination and generally where it was? So far, I haven't come up with anywhere outside of a few areas along the Brazilian border that are special reserves set aside and closed off for indigenous tribes of people who choose to remain completely isolated from the outside world. Yep, there still are places like that in the world, and there still are tribes that live, honestly, not very far from where I live now in Cusco. As far as the latest news in Peru, things have been relatively calm for several weeks now and likely will remain so for a couple more months. But there's still some news to report. A few days ago, Avianca Airlines announced they're going to start a new route between Cusco and Bogota, Colombia. Using Airbus A320 planes, which hold 180 passengers, there's going to be 4 flights a week between the two cities. Also, there appears to be some progress on the serious problem with Machu Picchu ticket availability at the last minute in Aguascalientes. Ticket availability has been a big problem at Machu Picchu this year. Earlier in the year, when tickets were unavailable online, many dishonest agencies were selling trips and telling their clients that tickets could easily be purchased in Aguascalientes at the last minute, when at that time there were no tickets available. In recent weeks, now that 1,000 tickets have been set aside each day, massive lines formed as early as 3 a.m. for people wishing to buy tickets, only to find out that no tickets were available, for reasons that, to be honest, have never been made clear. The Ministry of Foreign Commerce and Tourism announced yesterday, however, that some changes are being made intended to, quote, improve the tourist experience. One change is to move the ticket sales office to the Cultural Center in Aguascalientes and open more windows. Many times I've been to the current ticket office, which is located inside the Machu Picchu administrative offices. I've never seen more than 2 windows open despite several other windows available. Also, tickets will become available at 2 p.m. for the following day now. This means that when most people who arrive somewhere between 11:30 and noon each day, they'll be able to go eat lunch and still have time to get in line at the Cultural Center and hopefully be able to move quickly to purchase some of those tickets that are available for the following day, and then can relax, maybe wander around town a little bit and visit some of the places which I've talked about in other episodes, and then be ready to go to Machu Picchu the next day. There was no time schedule announced when these changes will take place. The second can be done almost immediately, but it's going to take some time to move the ticket office to the Cultural Center. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to or follow the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you're notified when a new episode comes out, and please share it with anyone you think might be interested. Episodes are also posted now on my YouTube channel, appropriately called the Peru channel, under the podcast tab. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in Peru soon.